Eddie Howe in or Eddie Howe out? Let's debate. How's it, everybody? Welcome back to the container. On the eve of a massive clash, Newcastle are facing PSG in the Champions League, and it's make or break whether or not Newcastle can get into the automatic qualifying positions into their top 8. Much of the debate currently is whether or not Eddie Howe should stay on as Newcastle manager or whether it's time to move on. So let's look at the reasons why Eddie Howe should stay as Newcastle manager, but let's also look at the argument whether it's time to move on to pastures new for Newcastle United and possibly for Eddie Howe himself. Let's start off by looking at the positive reasons why Eddie Howe should stay on as Newcastle manager. First and foremost, recent success. For most Newcastle fans, Howe has significantly improved the team, and that culminated last year in Newcastle lifting meaningful domestic silverware for the first time in 70 years. Let's not forget, he beat a strong Arsenal side over 2 legs in the semi-final, and he beat the would-be reigning champions last season, Liverpool, in the final. An amazing tactical masterclass, giving Newcastle fans an unbelievable cherished memory, a memory that made grown men cry, and he will go down in folklore. There's an argument whether he'll get a statue, but we certainly can't take that away from him. On his CV, leading the club to major domestic silverware for the first time in over 7 decades. It's something many fans thought we would never ever experience after coming so close in the mid-90s in the league and losing FA Cup finals. I remember losing to Arsenal and then to Man United in FA Cup finals. We never really put up a fight. But that performance, the atmosphere, the chills down the spine, the tears rolling down the cheeks when we beat a very, very strong Liverpool side, Howe has to take a huge amount of credit for how he set the team up in that specific game, but how he bounced back from losing the League Cup final to Man United. He learned from his mistakes. He didn't make it a big hoo-ha. After we won the Arsenal game, there wasn't huge celebrations like there was the previous campaign, where it was an achievement to get to the final. He learned all the mistakes from there. He set the team up absolutely beautifully and led Newcastle to what is currently, from my point of view, the best ever day in my footballing life, supporting the Geordies. A strong identity. You can't argue with the fact that if you had to ask many Newcastle fans, what is Newcastle's current way of playing? There is an identity to Newcastle. Now, it also aligns with the club's DNA in terms of playing attacking football. This season aside, and I know it's very difficult to just be purely positive or purely negative, but let's look in a overall kind of summary or a review of Eddie Howe's Newcastle. You can't argue that there is a clear philosophy and clear identity in the way Eddie Howe wants a 4-3-3 with a keeper who's primarily focused at good kind of shot stopping, good fullbacks getting up the pitch, a central combative 3 in midfield, and 3 up front, a lone striker and wingers with pace to burn, one on high energy. Yes, that's got its fallbacks in terms of high risk on energy levels and injuries, but you can't argue that he has set Newcastle up with a DNA and a philosophy that most people can relate to, and one that we want to see at Newcastle. We've seen recently with Ruben Amorim at Man United in terms of the DNA not matching and the philosophy not matching, and I do think that having a manager who suits Newcastle's DNA in terms of that high press, high intensity, strong pace, combative midfield does resonate with most Newcastle fans, and that is certainly a plus in terms of the way Eddie Howe likes to play. Player development, you can't argue the likes of Joelinton. I mean, he was at the time the club's record signing for £40 million. He couldn't hit a barn door, and it's almost impossible now to think of Joelinton as anything else other than a combative midfielder, almost in that kind of Patrick Vieira. Opposition teams absolutely fearful that Joelinton's going to come smashing into you. There's not that many coaches I can think of that have taken a player and completely changed his position and turned players into real quality Premier League proven, high-level, consistent performers. The other one we got to think about is Jacob Murphy. He was nowhere near the first team, and over the last couple of seasons, he provided so many goals. He's really good on the press. His passing isn't really what he's known for, but he's got a vicious shot on him. He scored some amazing long-range goals. He's really good at covering back as well. And obviously the likes of Lewis Hall and Tino Livramento, they were bought for big money and they were young players. And a lot of the rhetoric and the narrative at the time was that was a huge waste of money. Eddie Howe, as we know, likes to bed players in. He very rarely throws players straight into the first team. I mean, Bruno took a few games to get into the team. Tonali took a few games as well. But in terms of his player development, it's one of the reasons why a couple of fans are thinking, Elanga might come good or should come good or hopefully will come good. The likes of Jacob Ramsey, he's obviously seen something that he likes in these players in terms of what he wants them to become and what they eventually can do for the team and for themselves. Anthony Gordon wasn't near the England squad, and he's now most likely Thomas Tuchel's first choice left wing. Eddie Howe has done that a lot to Anthony Gordon. I don't think he's made any players worse at the club. So that is a huge pro. And it's not a given that a manager can make a lot of players better. We were waxing lyrical last season in terms of what he's done with the squad. So player development is definitely a huge pro. It also increases players' value, which is good for the books. Let's not forget, so if we wanted to, for example, buy a striker, a Swedish striker for 60 million and selling for 125, a lot of that has to do with Eddie Howe's play development. It's not something that should be overlooked. The long-term vision of the club. Now, you could argue this is a positive and a negative, but let's look at it at a positive point of view. When PAF took over Newcastle a couple of years ago, Amanda Staveley said that their first choice manager was Unai Emery. Now, obviously, with the benefits of hindsight, we can see Unai Emery is pulling up trees at Aston Villa. He's doing unbelievably well. He had a good track record in Europe, more in the Europa League, not so much in the Champions League. He obviously didn't do so well at Arsenal either. But in terms of the long-term vision of the club, Eddie Howe, you can't argue that if you just sit back and think about when he took over the club, he got us so far away from that relegation zone. And that really built a platform in terms of springboarding us straight into the Champions League the following season. That was Newcastle reaching their objective slightly sooner than we anticipated. And as a result, we didn't really have the squad to cope with the Champions League and obviously on the Premier League. And our Premier League form really dipped and we didn't do as well as we hoped. And we didn't qualify for the next round of the Champions League. I think the PSG game at home, who will ever forget that amazing game? First time in so many years back in the Champions League. And Eddie Howe took us there. He took us away from the relegation zone. Yes, he got a couple of players in. Kieran Trippier was the first signing to come through. And that kind of was the magnet which attracted all of the players to say, oh, something's happening here. At the time, there was ridiculous rumors and expectations that we were going to sign Mbappe and Messi and Ronaldo, etc. And the reality of PSR kicked in. And we realized we weren't going to be able to bankroll the club the way that Chelsea or Man City did when they were taken over. But in terms of the long-term vision of the club, Eddie Howe is a consistent, nice guy. He never embarrasses the club. He is very professional in his press conferences. When we win a game, he's never ecstatic and over-celebrating. And when we lose a game, he's never throwing his toys out the cot or throwing his players under the bus or blaming a referee. Arne Slot is a perfect example of somebody who's always whinging and moaning at the referees every time they lose a game. You could argue that's slightly a negative that we could do with a manager with a bit more spite. But fundamentally, Eddie Howe has never let the club down in terms of their marketability or the communications. He's so professional. The way he bit his tongue and handled the Isak situation in the summer window, the way he didn't throw the board under the bus, who left him completely under-supported with no director of football and CEO, and he obviously did way more than what his job actually asked him to do. There is something there in terms of him being a long-term Newcastle United manager. As of today, in January 2026, Eddie Howe is the fourth longest serving manager in the Premier League. Now, we know Premier League managers have a very short shelf life, and anyone who stays 2 or 3 years at a Premier League club has got to be doing something right. I mean, Pep Guardiola's been there for 9.5 years. Arteta's been there for 6 years. And look how he's transformed Arsenal, albeit with a different transfer budget, etc. But there is something to say, Eddie Howe's currently the fourth longest serving manager in the Premier League. Marco Silva at Fulham is in number 3. And there is something to say with sticking with a manager who came to the club when we were flirting with relegation, took us into the top 10, led us straight into the Champions League, has given us a final in the League Cup, went back and won it a couple of years later, took us into another Champions League. And again, if you just look back on this, on the guy's CV, there's something to say that this is the guy to stick with long term. Based on what he's done for us in the last 4 years has been unbelievable. The last one is fan support, and now this one is a little bit more mighty. There's so many fans are saying Newcastle is the club and the environment where you stick with people when the going gets tough. You don't just throw managers away, the likes of Chelsea did back in the day. Some clubs have sacked managers for winning leagues or for winning FA Cups or even Champions League. Newcastle are not that kind of club. We're very family orientated, we're very loyal. We give people time, we give them support. Eddie Howe is going to have to do a hell of a lot worse for the fans in St. James's Park to start turning on him. Current success and current results haven't been ideal. We're not in West Ham's position currently or Tottenham's position currently with Thomas Frank and flirting with relegation over the last 2 seasons. We've been very stable, and I do think there's a huge amount of fan support for Eddie Howe, staying at Newcastle, backing him, trusting in him to build on what he's done over the last couple of years. I would love to hear what your views are. Are you Eddie Howe in? Are you Eddie Howe out? But now let's go look on the negative side, the prosecution, on why it would be pertinent making a change. The first one is inconsistent results. Now, we've seen in Eddie Howe's time that we either start really well or we start really slowly. There's some real periods where we lose drastic games, for example, away at Brentford or at West Ham, where you just don't see that performance coming. And from my point of view, I do put that on the manager in terms of making sure that the squad selection or the tactics or the formation is up. I do think there's been a hell of a lot more random losses than random wins. Now, I don't think anyone expected us to beat Arsenal or to beat Liverpool in the cup final, and those are huge positives. But I do sometimes think the players don't seem at it. And from my point of view, that's down to the manager, making sure you can see the players whilst they're in the changing room are up for the game. And that comes with the message, that comes with the tactical preparedness, that comes with the high quality and the high standards that the manager should expect from every player in every single game. You can argue that we don't have the squad depth that the Arsenals, Liverpools, Chelseas have, and that sometimes limits him in making different changes. But I do think you often see, okay, well, that's the result that's going to give us the kick up the arse. I mean, the result against Sunderland, that performance was unacceptable, let alone the result. The performance was unacceptable. And the manager have to take responsibility for that. Adaptability. This is a huge topic at the moment with regards to Eddie Howe's inability or refusal to change the tactics or to change something either when we're winning or when we're losing. We all know our away form has been absolutely dire this season. We all know that we conceded so many late goals in the early period of the season, and fans were crying out for something to change. The current buzzword at the moment is that Newcastle are severely lacking attacking creativity in the middle of the field. The first names that I think of when I'm thinking about what Newcastle are lacking is Hatem Ben Arfa, player in the middle who had unblistering pace and creativity and a magic fizz that could just do something out of nowhere, score a 30-yarder, or just play an unlocking pass to the strikers or the wingers. And that's something that Newcastle don't have. We're very flat and very boring and rely a lot on our midfielders getting up in support where we don't really have that player as a number 10. You could argue, where's that player going to fit in? How are we going to fit him into the squad? I have previously toyed with the idea of playing with a false nine. Man United have done it recently with good success. And if Voltemade and Visa aren't doing anything up front, I do think there's some logic in certain games to play with a false nine who can help with the press in attack and just create havoc and chaos for defenders who don't know who to pick up. And a lot of fans are saying this is exactly what happened at Bournemouth. Eddie Howe played one-dimensional football. Whether we're winning or whether we're losing, the formation is a 4-3-3. He brings on like-for-like players. If the striker is not working, he just takes that striker off and brings another one on. And we are starting to hear the moans and the groans from the fans in the stadium in terms of Eddie Howe, change something. Let's see Visa and Voltemade up together, for example. But is that more of an issue with the players that Eddie Howe has, or is it an issue with him not being able to be creative or have any tactical nous in terms of seeing a game out or going and winning and nicking a game? The squad development challenges. Now, we've listed the positives in terms of how he's made certain players better. There is an argument to say that a couple of the players have kind of reached their peak and there has been a drop in performance, especially from the likes of Anthony Gordon, especially from the likes of Tonali. Gomares is the only kind of star who seems to have been kind of getting better every season. There is an argument that the Eddie Howe name or Eddie Howe brand is not as attractive, for example, as a Mourinho or a Mancini or a Conte, for example. I've constantly said that most of the value in recruitment for a club like Newcastle is going to be in Europe. We can't afford to go and pick the best player out of every Premier League team. For Newcastle to go into Europe and find a gem which many other European teams are vying for, I don't think they look at Eddie Howe and go, wow, I want to play under that manager. You think about Joao Pedro that we missed on, you think about Sesko and Buemo. There's an argument whether that was financial or is an argument of whether or not they could actually achieve what they wanted to at Newcastle. I'll always think about what Man City did, and again, I appreciate it was a different world with PSR back then, but they had Mark Hughes that took them to a certain level and got them up there in that kind of top half of the table. They then went down the Pellegrini and went down the Mancini route to really attract the Agueros and the David Silvas and those European players that are reaching the peak of their career and players saying, yes, that's the manager I want to play for. There's definitely, in my opinion, that about Unai Emery at Aston Villa. If you mention Unai Emery's name in Europe, most players will know who he is. Most players won't know who Eddie Howe is. Pressure from the ownership. Will PIF eventually get itchy feet and think, well, this is not going anywhere at the pace that we wanted to go? You can argue they haven't done much with regards to stadium and training ground. Let's just focus on this being a negative point from PIF's perspective. We've done really well to get ourselves in the Champions League over the last 2 seasons. We've got silverware. There could be a question on their minds about, okay, what's next? Is Eddie Howe really the man that's going to win us a Premier League title? Is he going to get us into top 4 consistently? Is he going to attract the big players? Is he going to be that manager that takes us up to the next level? What is that next level? From my point of view, it's probably consistently being in the top 4, consistently getting to semi-finals and finals of domestic cups, but also getting to that quarter-final, semi-final stage regularly of the Champions League. Now, Eddie Howe's got a lot of plates to spin in terms of how we actually get there. There's so much to do with finances, so much to do with tactics, so much to do with squad depth. It's not purely just down on Eddie Howe, the manager. And there's so many facets which have to go right and which could go wrong in terms of us achieving that level. But the issue that I think the ownership model might have is that Eddie Howe's not done this before. Unai Emery has. He's won European Cups. He's fighting for a Premier League title at the moment. Newcastle haven't been close to fighting for a Premier League title. And it is a bit of a risk that they might be willing to take in terms of looking back and thinking, we need to make a change here. We've gone as far as we can go. We think we've reached our peak with this guy. and it might be worth a change. There is always rumors about Jose Mourinho. The name Mourinho would bring a lot of havoc, but a lot of fizz to Newcastle's. I think players who might be umming and ahhing, for example, a Sesko might think, I want to play for Mourinho instead of Amarin, at the time. So it's going to be really interesting to see what PIF do. Don't forget, Stavely is not there anymore. She was a huge Eddie Howe fan, and she would be backing him in the boardroom. I do think the PIF are a little bit more cutthroat. So let's see what they do. And this leads us on to the last topic in terms of risk of stagnation. The Premier League has evolved in the last 2 seasons. I mean, we see it being so much about set pieces now, so much about long throws, but it just feels a bit kind of same old, same old. I don't see Newcastle coming up with something new, something weird. I mentioned the false 9, for example. Eddie Howe seems very safe and 4-3-3, and the whole insanity about doing the same thing, expecting a different result. What's going to change from Anthony Gordon? Do we need to sell, to buy? Is that Eddie Howe having a bit of favoritism? There's a huge argument as to why he continuously lets Anthony Gordon play on the left as opposed to Harvey Barnes. He's been by far our most creative and attacking forward. Although Anthony Gordon has performed really well in the Champions League, in the Premier League, he has been absolutely dire, but continuously gets picked in the beginning of the season above Willisula as a striker. And we know what a horrible start we had to the season with Anthony Gordon playing up front because our mate chose not to play for us. He does seem to be very loyal to the likes of Dan Burn. He consistently played Dan Burn at left back, and I love Dan Burn, but he is not a left back. Anthony Gordon is not a striker, but there seemed to be this loyalty or this stubbornness in terms of, I will get this right, it will happen. And a lot of the times the fans are saying this is staring you in the face. The Voldemort issue, the Visser issue, playing up front alone. Voldemort is so isolated, and there just seems to be a bit of kind of rinse and repeat. We know what we're going to get, but that means the opposition also know what they're going to get, and they can completely set up for it. So there you go. There's a couple of points listing why Eddie Howe should stay on as Newcastle manager, or some points in terms of it's time to make a change. What do you think? What's your view? Should we stick with the guy? Be loyal, he will come right, or is it time to make a change? Thanks so much for watching. Please do give us a like and subscribe, and don't forget,